Well, my name is Ben, and I serve as the family life pastor here, and our lead pastor, Jason, is away at a lake, so hopefully he's doing okay wherever he is, and it's my privilege to continue on in our series today, talking all about boundaries. And we are been going through a book called Boundaries by Cloud, and we have been doing that through a series called Space Invaders. And we've said that boundaries are basically they're personal property lines where you delineate where my responsibility in my life begins and where it ends, right? It's saying here's where I begin and here's where I end, and here is where my personal space, my boundary lies. In our relationships, we have all sorts of people who oftentimes, if we're not careful, will try to cross over into our boundaries. Maybe they'll try to invade our space. And so that's why we've titled our series Space Invaders, right? We get it now, right? And if you just got that for the first time, that's okay. Okay, you're welcome, okay? But we're talking about space invaders, and if we think hard in our lives, surely all of us can think of a person or maybe a relationship, or maybe it's even with our jobs. We can think of those who we might be able to call space invaders. Those who are always trying to get inside of our personal or our family's personal space and our boundaries that we have set up for health. And oftentimes when we think of this idea of setting up boundaries, it's typically something we know we should be doing, but we have a reluctancy to do so because setting up boundaries is difficult. I think one of the reasons that we have hesitancy when it comes to setting up boundaries either in our personal lives or in our relationships with our loved ones is because we have, without even maybe realizing it, have bought into some of the boundary myths. And so today I want to talk about the top 5 boundary myths that we can sometimes find ourselves believing if we're not careful. Now, a myth for our simple definition today is a fiction that looks like a truth. There's all sorts of myths out there, things that may not be true, but they look like they could be true. When I was a kid growing up, I had a terrifying fear of spiders, right? I was an arachnophobic through and through, right? And it didn't help that I watched the movie Arachnophobia when I was like 5 years old. Anyone ever seen that movie? Ridiculous movie, right? Just absurd. And I was terrified of spiders. And at one point in my life, I had heard a statistic about spiders that shook me to my core. And the statistic looked a little something like this. Maybe you've heard it before. And it says, on average, each human eats 8 spiders in their sleep during their lifetime. What? You know? How many of you guys have heard that or some variation of that before in your life, right? A terrifying statistic, especially for a young boy who's already just beside himself when it comes to spiders, right? Yesterday in my office, I'm reading through my script, and all of a sudden, I see a giant, like, daddy long leg sitting there just staring at me, right? And so I smashed the thing, and I felt pretty proud of myself. But for a little kid, this was so scary for me. And I remember as a kid, because I believed this, when I would go to bed, I would put the covers over my head trying to sleep so that the spiders wouldn't crawl into my mouth. You know what I'm saying? And it was the most ridiculous thing because I believed in something that had no factual evidence to support it. I believed in a myth, right? It's the similar myth where it's like daddy longlegs are, the most venomous spiders, but they can't bite you because their fangs are long, right? It's complete nonsense, right? There's no factual evidence for that, but we believe in it, and it causes us sometimes in our lives, when we believe in fictions that look like truths, it causes us to affect our lives, and it causes us to behave in ways that we might not normally. And so today, as we're talking about dispelling myths, well, I want you to be asking yourself as we're going through this list, what myths may I be believing? And so today we're going through the top 5 boundary myths. And we're going to be rolling through this. It's never easy kind of going through the list today. So in lieu of having a family-style service, kids are in with us. I want to have a little fun, maybe have a little participation, all right? So I want to hear back from you guys. Everyone say, myth number 1. Excellent job. Thank you, kids in the back there, all right? Myth number one is this: if I set boundaries, I'm being selfish. Oftentimes when we need to set up boundaries, that means we have to set lines in the sand that kind of say do not cross, right? I've moved into our home about a month ago, and already I've had 3 different conversations or more with my neighbors about where the property lines are, right? It always happens surrounding mowing your yard. You ever notice that, right? It's like, where's the line here, okay? And they're perfectly pleasant conversations, and I was just more like, hey, I saw that you kind of mow here. Do you want me to kind of mow up against that, right? But it's a necessary conversation because we need to know, what am I responsible for here, and what are you responsible here? And myth number one is if I set boundaries, I'm being selfish. Because oftentimes inherent in setting boundaries means you have to have the willingness to say and look someone in the eye and give them the answer no, right? Maybe someone asks you to do something, or they throw something on your lap that never belonged to you in the first place. And setting boundaries means we might have to look at that person and give them that answer that sometimes we don't like to give. We might have to say the words no. I don't know about you, but I'm more the type of person where I would rather hear a no than give a no. Anyone else like that in here? And so for this one, this can be a really difficult thing for people, especially for Christians, right? Because after all, aren't we called to be selfless towards the people around us? I mean, in 1 Corinthians 10:24, it says no one should seek their own good, but the good of others, right? And some of you, this may be your life verse, right? Where it's like, I'm going to kill myself for the sake of others. I'm going to not worry about my own health and my own personal well-being and how things are functioning and balance in my life, but I'm just going to give until I run myself ragged, right? Never mind the fact that this verse is specifically talking about food sacrificed to idols, right? We look at this and we think, I need to die to myself and disregard all my personal space and boundaries and health just so that I can go after and help other people. And part of this is somewhat true. I mean, we are called to love those around us. That's all throughout Scripture. But I want to define selfishness here. As the book Boundaries defines it, says this for selfishness. It says a fixation on our own wishes and desires to the exclusion of our responsibility to love others. In other words, there's nothing necessarily inherently wrong in focusing on what our needs are and making sure we're taking care of what we need to get done and making sure we're healthy. But when it comes to the exclusion of our responsibility given by God to love others, that's when it becomes selfishness. And so what we see is boundary setting is less about selfishness, and it's actually more about stewardship. Taking care of what's been given to us. The Bible speaks a lot about stewardship. Because God has given us finite resources, a finite body, a finite amount of time, we only have 24 hours in the day, we ought to be good stewards of what He has given us. It's an important thing. Because each of us have our boundary lines of what this is the area in which I am responsible for, right? And in order to set up boundaries, we have to say no to the harmful things in our life so that we can say yes to the beneficial things in our life, right? In order to say yes to the things that are best, in order to say yes to the things that are great, we oftentimes have to say no to those things that are not so, right? Now, and we see this all over. We don't look at a company who has pretty strict safety rules and safety guidelines as a company that's being selfish. We look at it as a company that has to steward their employees. Anyone out here ever worked at a place where there's a little bit of inherent danger maybe involved? Maybe it's construction, or maybe it's a plant or a factory, okay? A lot of you. Maybe you've seen a sign like this before, right? This job has worked 0 days without an accident, right? Ooh, no company wants to see that, right? Because this means that someone probably broke a safety guideline at some point or another. This means that at some point an accident happened, and because of that, the company now has to, shell out a fortune in often cases with doctor's appointments, MRIs, specialists, drug screens, surgeries, time off, work comp insurance, work comp settlements, on and on and on, right? And so what does a company do? It sets up guidelines, it sets up boundaries. It's a real damper to morale when, an employee loses an arm in a machine, you know what I'm saying? And so we don't look at a company and say, man, they're just being selfish. How could they? We look at it and say, they're being good stewards of their people. And the same is true in our own lives as well. We ought to be good stewards of the things that God has given us. And that is what allows us to be caring and be loving and be aware and attentive to the needs around us, right? Some of the most generous people I know, most helpful people I know are those who have been good stewards of the financial resources that God has given them, right? So that's myth number 1. So far, so good? We doing all right? Give me a thumbs up. Kids, you guys still with me? If you're a kid in the room, say, yeah. Oh, you can do better than that. Say, yeah. All right, you guys might like this next one. Everyone say myth number 2. And we're going to move through these a little bit quickly. Myth number 2 is this: boundaries are a sign of disobedience. And this goes hand in hand sort of with this first one, that I'm being selfish and I'm being disobedient to God by having boundaries in my life. When I was a little kid in elementary school, I loved playing with my neighbors. Any of you kids just love playing with your friends that are around you? Yeah. And I had a friend who we were really close in proximity, but we weren't necessarily close in relationship. You have people like that in your life, right? Close in proximity, not so close in relationship. And we would hang out all the time, and there would be times, though, where we'd hang out a little too much, and I'd kind of get a little tired of him. And there'd be times where my friend would be like, hey, Ben, can I come over and play? And instead of giving my friend a no, I would say, yeah, I guess you can come over. And I remember as a kid, my friend would come over to my house, and then I would play with him for a little while, and then I'd get tired of him because I never really wanted to hang out with him in the first place. And so I would just kind of ignore him. And he'd be inside playing video games, and I'd go outside playing basketball. He'd come out and join me playing basketball, and I'd skirt around and get inside and play video games. And it's the silliest thing, right? Now, you kids have never done anything like that, right? No, of course not, okay? And I look back at that now, and we hear that illustration, and it's ridiculous. And yet, how many times as adults do we do something very similar? How many times do we say yes on the outside when the whole time on the inside we're screaming, no, 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 I don't want to do this? And this myth is one that says by saying no, I'm being a bad host. By saying no to that request to serve the church for the 8th time this month, I'm being a bad servant. To say no means that I'm being a bad blank, and therefore I'm being disobedient to God. And so the boundaryless person says yes to serving 8 times a month, says yes to the surprise visits by the in-laws that seem to last a little bit too long, right? A boundaryless person says yes to answering every phone call and every text. Why? Because they're unable to say no. And so what happens is we oftentimes will become compliant on the outside, while the whole time on the inside we're just becoming resentful, even rebellious. We're willing to say yes, right? We're willing to say, sure, I'll help again. Sure, come on over and visit for 3 hours, even though I have 15 other things I need to be doing right now, and the kids need stuff, and my husband, whatever. Sure, come on over. And the whole time on the inside, it's eating us up. And if this goes unchecked, it leads to some seriously difficult things, and that's why the Bible speaks to this. And it says here in Matthew 5:37, Jesus says, all you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond that comes from the evil one, right? It's kind of harsh. Keep your yeses, yeses, and your noes, noes. 2 Corinthians 9 says this: each of you, when it talks about giving and talks about tithing and offering, it says, each of you should give what you've decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. You see, God is a God who measures the attitudes of the heart. God is a God who doesn't just want the external praise and the raising of the hands and the worship and saying yes to every little thing. God is a God who tests the motives of what's in here. It's for this reason that An internal no nullifies an external yes. And resentment can build, and anger and frustration, right? You ever notice those people who all of a sudden they lash out at the telemarketer, right? The telemarketer calls at the inopportune time or calls at dinner and they pick up the phone because they can't say no. They have to pick up the phone. And all of a sudden it's a telemarketer at the most inopportune moment. And all of a sudden they're blowing up. And there's anger and there's frustration. And Cloud puts it this way in his book. He quotes, "This is why individuals with injured boundaries often are shocked by the rage they feel inside when they begin setting limits. This is generally not a new anger, it's old anger. It's often years of no's that were never voiced, never respected, and never listened to." That's why it's so important to be able to set up boundaries, because we get eaten up inside if we don't. And that's not disobedience to God. In fact, God tests the attitude of our hearts, and he wants our attitude to be one of cheerfulness. And he wants to test that, okay? All right, everyone say myth numero tres.
Myth numero tres.
Muy bien. Hablas español. Oh, excelente. Okay. Number 3 is this: if I set boundaries, I will hurt and be hurt by others. The fact of the matter is that setting boundaries, as we said in week 1, it oftentimes is associated with a price. There's oftentimes a price that has to be paid in order to give a no. And chances are, if you've ever experienced this in your life, chances are that the people you're setting up boundaries with, they might react with anger. And they might withdraw from you. That's a natural consequence at times. But what we're seeing is that when we set up boundaries, what we're actually doing is we're creating a litmus test for the quality of the relationship, right? Because if a person is only hanging out with you, has a relationship with you for your yeses, right? What are they going to do when you give them a no? And so it's a litmus test to the quality, right? If you can't handle me at my worst, you don't deserve me at my best. You ever heard that? Okay. I love that saying. I love it. That's sarcasm. And so it's important to remember here. Boundaries oftentimes are associated with a price. It is truly a litmus test. I remember when I was in high school, and kids, maybe you can relate to this as well. I remember when I was a kid, I had these friends, and these friends would go off to and do some things that just weren't very good for them. They would get into trouble, and my friends, they would go to hangouts with other friends, and they would do stuff that just wasn't right. And I remember I had to talk to my friends, and I had to look at them and say, hey, I can't go with you to those sorts of parties where bad things are happening. And I'd have to look at my friends and say, hey, I have to put a boundary in place here. Like, I can't be a part of this lifestyle that you're living. And I remember slowly but surely, those relationships that I thought were tight, the relationships that I thought there was a serious bond, slowly but surely began to erode. And slowly but surely, my friends began to distance themselves from me, withdraw. A lot of them were frustrated with me, called me names, made fun of me. And what I learned at that season of my life is what we've already talked about so far, is that when you set a boundary in place, what you're doing is you're saying, you're testing, and you're saying, how good and how strong is this relationship? Are you willing to love me enough, to care about me enough, even when I'm willing to, or when I'm setting up a boundary and saying no? It tests it, it refines it. That's why setting up boundaries is so important, to have other safe people in your life. That's what the church is for, right? For when you have to have that hard conversation with that loved one, you're surrounded by a group of people who are there for you and who love you. Even Jesus himself had to set limits despite the opinions of others. In Luke 5, we read this account. It says, yet the news about him, this is Jesus, spread all the more, so that crowds of people came to hear him, to be healed of their sicknesses. All right, so crowds of people would often come to Jesus, many traveling probably for many miles. Parents most likely bringing their sick children to Jesus, hoping for a miracle. Maybe parents at their last rope who would do anything for their kids, traveling and going through the dust and the mire, all so that Jesus could see them and heal them. But in verse 16, we read this, but Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. Oftentimes, even in the midst of these crowds, Jesus would have to set up a boundary, remove himself, and go be alone. Even Jesus Christ, right? Fully God, was also fully man and had to set up limitations for himself. Now, follow me for a second. Do you think that there's a very real possibility that some of the people in these crowds got upset with Jesus about this? Yeah, I think it's safe to presume that. I think it's a very real possibility that a parent with a sick kid who had traveled miles to come to Jesus could have been very upset by this action. That the fact that they were there, they were in the crowd, Jesus was right there, but then all of a sudden Jesus was no longer there. But we, today in the 21st century, we don't look at Jesus' actions and say, oh man, how selfish of him. How could he? Man, Jesus was being disobedient to the Father by setting up that boundary, right? Man, Jesus really hurt those people by doing that. No, instead we say, man, thank you, God, that Jesus showed us how to set up proper limits. See, Jesus showed us that even while he was fully God, he was also fully man, with a body, with time, with limitations. And we too have those same limitations. We too have to set up boundaries with people. Cloud puts it this way: appropriate boundaries don't control, attack, or hurt anyone. They simply prevent your treasures from being taken at the wrong time. See, our boundaries are never meant to be an offensive tool, right? They're never meant to be an offensive weapon, something that we wield and say, I'm setting up this limit with you, stay away, and we poke and we prod at people. Instead, they're a defensive shield, a tool that prevents your time, talent, and treasure from being taken at the wrong time so that they can be given at the right time. All right? Number 4, everyone say, number 4. You guys aren't losing energy, are you? Come on, number 4. I love it. All right, very good. Number 4 is this: boundaries cause feelings of guilt. In premarital counseling, one of the most important topics that we talk about is setting up appropriate boundaries with your parents, right? Anyone who's been married knows that there's always that relationship shift that happens whenever you get married, right? You have to set up appropriate boundaries with your parents. Sometimes the parents are very, very involved in a couple's lives, and the couple sometimes need to step back and say, hey, we actually need a little bit of space. And so often what this myth is uncovering is that when comes time to setting up boundaries with the people we love most, we're oftentimes afraid of hurting them. Because after all, they've given so much to us already. How can I possibly say no to them? This is the person who, the friend who was there for you during that extremely hard season of your life. And now because of that, they expect you to be there for them, for that big season of their life, and then the next one and the next one. And the whole time, maybe they need to be setting up appropriate boundaries themselves, and they need to be getting help, but they become that overly needy person, and they become time and time again and start putting responsibility on you. It's the parent who says to you, man, I really wish you'd visit more, right? Any of you ever been there? It's the boss who in the last hour dumps his work on your lap and says, oh, I know you can take care of it, right? And so often with these people who are closest to us, we can feel that sense of guilt when it comes time to actually saying no. But again, I think it's so important to look to Jesus' example, right? Because it wasn't just the crowds who he set up boundary with, but it was also some of the people that he was closest to. Jesus Christ had to even set up boundaries with his very own disciples, those who were traveling and walking with him and chose to follow him with his whole life. Jesus, in Matthew 16:23, says that Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." I mean, talk about a rough boundary set. And this is with someone that Jesus had an incredibly personal relationship with. This is with someone who had devoted their life to following Jesus, and Jesus at times has to just lay down the law. Because boundaries are so important. And it's so important when it comes to the people that we love most to not get the two issues confused, right? The two issues of gratitude on one hand and boundaries on the other. So often we think it has to be either or. We're afraid to set up boundaries because that means I'm ungrateful, when in reality we can't get the two confused. The two can go hand in hand. We can remain incredibly grateful for our parents, incredibly grateful for our friends who are there for us, who bosses, who give us opportunities, but we can also simultaneously set up appropriate boundaries in our lives. So be grateful, but also keep in mind that guilt is a lousy motivator, right? You ever notice that in your life? When we act or react out of guilt, it rarely ends well internally or externally, okay? All right, everyone say last myth. Ooh, very good, all right. Here we go. This one's, we'll keep this short and sweet as we wrap up here. But number 5 is this: boundaries are permanent. So often we think this idea, well, if I set up this boundary and I kind of draw this line in the sand, if I create this rule with this person, they'll never talk to me again, and I have to keep that in place. And I have to stick to my guns, and I have to fight through it. And sometimes we can think boundaries are permanent. And in all of this conversation and through all of this series, it's so important to remember this. It's important to remember that you own your boundaries. Your boundaries don't own you, right? If you set up a boundary and you draw a line and set up your personal property line with someone and they respond really well, they make the appropriate changes that they need, or maybe you're now in a healthier place, there's no reason you can't readjust those. Because you own your boundaries, they don't own you, all right? I know that's a long list of 5 there, but I want to just put them all on the screen at once, and I want to, as we close in worship, to just pause for a moment, and I want you to look over this list and ask yourself, which one of these boundary myths am I inclined to believe? Which one of these on the screen here, if I'm truly honest in my heart of hearts with God who searches my heart, which one of these am I tempted to buy into? And the second question I have for you tonight is this: what fictions or myths in your life have you believed? Are there any lies in your life that you need God to speak truth into? Are there any fictions that you need to dispel? And this could be a variety of things. Maybe it's something like, I'm not doing enough. Or perhaps it's the fiction of, if I set up a boundary, they'll never talk to me again. Maybe for some of you, it's the fiction of believing that God is upset with me, that he's angry, that I've been too selfish or too disobedient for him to approve of me. And maybe for some of you, it's the myth that I'll never get control over my life. That I am bound to be in these messy relationships. I'm bound to struggle day in and day out and never have full peace of heart and full peace of mind. So wherever you're at, I want to just pause for a second in your own heart and your own mind. Just ask yourself, are there any untruths? Are there any lies in my heart and in my life that I've been believing? Are there any myths I've been telling myself, either about my own worth and whether or not I think I deserve to live a life of freedom? And would you just allow in these next moments for God to speak into those? Maybe for some of you, as we're talking about these space invaders in our life, maybe for some of you, you know the boundary that you need to set up in your life. Maybe you know the exact conversation that needs to happen after you leave from here. Would you allow God to give you the courage to go and do that conversation and have that? Maybe for some of you, it's with family coming in town for the holiday. Maybe you know you need to have a tough talk. And I want to encourage you, when it comes to setting boundaries, I want to learn from John 1:14. I want to follow Jesus' example. When it says this, it says, we have seen Jesus' glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. And I want to encourage you this morning that if there's a conversation that needs to take place, would you exemplify the character of Jesus Christ, and would you model grace and truth in that conversation? Would you be willing, through the help of God himself, to speak the truths that need to be spoken in order that you might be good stewards over your lives, in order that you might have the freedom that God is calling you to? But would you also do it as lovingly as humanly possible? And would you check the motivations of your heart and ask God to search your heart and say, God, if there's any unclean way about me, if there's any mixed motivation here, God, reveal that to me. Radiant Church, my hope for you is that we would be a people who make it right in our relationships. That we would be a people who are willing to set up those boundaries so that we can protect our family and give them what's best and allow God to give us the freedom that he's calling every single one of us, life in life to the full. What are the lies you've been telling yourself? What are the boundaries you need to set up? May we worship Jesus Christ, who freely gave his life for us so that we might be saved. This free gift, free of guilt, free of shame. May we accept that and enjoy the freedom that he's freely offering us. And may our balanced lives be praiseworthy to him. Let's pray.